All right, welcome everyone. We'll get started in just 1 minute. A couple of stragglers. I'll do some housekeeping and then we'll dive into the meat. Sure there's not a... Okay, good, that'll pop. All right, why don't we jump in? Well, thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to do just a quick couple of housekeeping items, and then we'll jump into the meat of the presentation. So thank you for taking the time. Just to let you know, I have everybody on mute just for the beginning portion. We'll do a presentation that kind of talks a little bit about the various elements of the crop project and of the issue of trespass grows. But then there will be a section for question and answers as we after we finish the presentation. If for some reason you have something that you need to ask, you feel free to use the chat, and you can either chat me directly, I'll be moderating, or just chat to everyone, and I'll kind of weigh whether we can hold off on it or it would be a good thing to add within the presentation. Just to let everyone know too, just for full transparency, we are recording this. We will put it up on YouTube, and so that it can also be shared. We've had a number of folks who can't make the call, but want to get the information. So thank you again for joining, everyone. And now I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Rich McIntyre, who's the Executive Director for the Community Governance Partnership and the Director of the Crop Project. All right. Oh, I forgot your different name. Hold on. All right, Rich, you should be good to unmute and you're ready to go.
Great. Thanks, folks. Greatly appreciate you being here today. We know you all have busy schedules and other things to do, so thanks for joining us. It's a great pleasure to introduce some of you to the Crop Project for the first time and update others on what's going on, who we are, and more importantly, what the status is of trespass grows on public lands in California. So first, I just want to do a little bit of background on crop. I won't take too much time. But what I will say is that by the middle of the last decade, trespass grows on public lands were exploding across Northern California. To determine the extent of the problem and support for addressing it, the Community Governance Partnership and the California Wilderness Coalition began a series of stakeholder interviews in the Emerald Triangle. For our purposes, that's Mendocino, Trinity, and Humboldt County, to meet with stakeholders and get their reads on this problem. What we found was a very, very strong bipartisan consensus on how extensive the problem was, that it represented a clear and present danger to communities and tribes, and that it was increasing dramatically, and that a vacuum, a big vacuum, existed in both knowledge and leadership on the subject. And so to fill that vacuum, the Community Governance Partnership and Cal Wild in 2018 formed the Crop Project. We formed an advisory board of directors to advise the project of many of the same stakeholders that I mentioned before. The advisory board includes federal land managers, conservation organizations, tribes, law enforcement, federal law enforcement, the legal industry, and county supervisors, and as well as the science community. Our focus and objectives are relatively straightforward. Our biggest objective is to increase public awareness and decision maker awareness of the issue, because we're constantly stunned by the reaction we get when national press comes out, and invariably the opening sentence is, "I had no idea this problem existed." So one of our jobs is to make sure that people knows the problem exists. It's to encourage federal action to fund reclamation of sites and increase federal law enforcement on the ground in the national forest to dissuade additional grows. And almost as important as anything else, or perhaps more important, is to increase the penalties for the environmental crimes that are associated with the grows. Because plant counts and that sort of thing are now passé, which is something we'll cover later in the project description. The lack of baseline information on the issue stunned us, frankly. the sum total of what's known about this was very, very small. And it led us to do new research work on trespass grow caused wildfires and pesticide impacts to public waters, which we'll also cover later in the event. Our most powerful tool is the press. Slide, please. Our most powerful tool is the press. And that is, one more slide, please, Chris. Sorry, I'm late on my cues. We use the press to raise the public profile of the project, to educate decision makers, and to galvanize public support for action at the state and the federal level. The press work is anchored by trespass grow visits with key national press outlets. In 2019, we took the Atlantic, NPR Morning Edition, and the Associated Press into a trespass grow in the Shasta Trinity National Forest, accompanied by federal law enforcement and scientists. That coverage resulted in some of the stuff that you see on your screen right now. An article in Atlantic that talked about the dangers of the uptake of pesticides by cannabis plants, the environmental catastrophe in your joint, to NPR Morning Edition, and over 275 publications across the state. That resulted in an estimated 15 million people seeing that coverage. In 2021, in October, we took NBC News into a trespass grow in the Cleveland National Forest. That coverage was seen on NBC, on the Today Show, NBC Nightly News, Peacock, and all of their outlets by somewhere between 8 and 16 million people. So the national press continues to play a key role in our outreach and a key role in both raising the profile of the project and influencing decision makers. We're going to talk about some of this a little bit more later on, but right now I'd like to do issue background and kind of focus the group on how we got here and what the actual conditions of trespass grows are. And for that, I will turn it over to our field director, Jackie Riccio. Jackie.
Thanks, Rich. So just a quick intro for me. My name is Jacqueline Riccio. I'm the regional field director for the crop project. My background is in wildlife biology and archaeology, and I've done an extensive amount of wildlife related work in the northern region here. So I act as kind of a supportive science advisor and researcher for the project. So first, I'd like to start off with discussing what exactly a trespass grow is. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but we'll just do a quick definition. So a trespass grow is a secretive illicit cannabis grow on public lands or on private lands. Examples of this include grows that are on national forests or on national parks, or sometimes large timber holdings like Sierra Pacific, or on large ranches. But for the purposes of crop, when we use the term trespass grow, it's only referring to public lands such as national forests, national parks, or state lands. But crop specifically focuses right now on federal public lands. So the first photo here is an on-the-ground shot of a trespass grow in the Shasta Trinity National Forest in Northern California. And the second photo here is an aerial view of what a trespass grow looks like. And this is also from the Shasta T. Next slide, please. So trespass grows contain lots of EPA-banned neurotoxic pesticides and restricted California pesticides. So one of the most toxic pesticides that we find at these sites is called carbofuran, and the common brand is Q4M. Carbofuran is the most toxic carbamate pesticide manufactured globally. It's essentially, it's an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor, which is a fancy term for, it's a neurotoxin, so it interrupts your neural pathways. So it's very dangerous, and it's found widely at sites now. Over 90% of the sites that are eradicated, we see carbofuran at them. And it's also uptaken by the plant. So it's extremely deadly for consumers of trespass cannabis. And of course, those health hazards haven't exactly been studied all the way, but we do know it's happening. And it's also dangerous for the growers, and they definitely don't have good safety practices with this. The other type of pesticide we see commonly at trespass grows is second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, fancy term for rat poisons. These are some of the brands, you'll see Bait Block, Decon, and the specific chemical is bromadiolone or brodifacoum. And these are restricted pesticides in California, so you have to have a permit to use them. And you can only use them in certain types of situations. They're extremely toxic to wildlife, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on that. But essentially, it disrupts the vitamin K cycle and ends in hemorrhagic death. So extremely toxic, and we know that it's impacted a number of different ESA listed and CESA listed species like the Pacific fisher and northern spotted owls. And the last photo here is a picture of a snared doe, black-tailed doe. And this is another kind of trap that we'll see commonly at trespass grows. A lot of the growers are living off the land in addition to growing on it. So lots of poached and poisoned wildlife at these sites. Next slide, please. Trespass grows also contain excessive quantities of fertilizer. And fertilizer is bad for one main reason. When you have these bags of fertilizer and you're using them at these sites, during seasonal precipitation, all those kind of nutrients get washed into the water courses and cause a process called eutrophication, which is what causes the toxic algal blooms in our water courses up here. And essentially that nutrient loading that goes into the water, algae feed on it, and then they can cover the surface of the water, these blooms, and it makes the water lose oxygen. So it's extremely toxic for aquatic life and for our native salmon, which are already in decline from drought and other environmental conditions and overfishing. So the fertilizer is a really big problem. We recently conducted a site visit to the Cleveland National Forest with press, where NBC and other national media outlets were, and there were several hundred pounds of unused fertilizer there. So it's certainly a problem at these sites in these remote areas. Next slide, please. Trespass grows also contain a ton of trash, literal tons of trash. Camping equipment, food, empty containers, alcohol cans, empty pesticide bottles, you name it, human waste, lots of that. It's quite nasty, the trash scenes at these sites. And aside from the kind of obvious environmental impacts of having, non-biodegradable plastics and all this garbage in these remote sensitive ecosystems, it also can wash into water courses. So when we get lots of seasonal precipitation, all of this plastic waste and things like that can just go right into the water courses downstream. And then another thing is that it's a huge attractant to wildlife. So the poisons that I referenced in one of the first slides, it gets into wildlife populations more readily because of all the food trash that is at these sites. It's an attractant to wildlife. So you see lots of predators and other curious animals coming to this food source. So one of the reclamations that I was on, I think we hauled out 4 tons of trash using helicopters. So, whatever they pack in, they're not packing out. It's a big problem. Next slide, please. Trespass grows also contain poached and poisoned wildlife carcasses, which impact wildlife on a landscape scale. So the main reason that we see all this poisoned wildlife is because of the poisons that are there, because of those toxicants. And it's not just that they're actually consuming toxicants at the site and every single animal is getting poisoned directly from the site. It's actually that we're seeing a bioaccumulation through the food web. There was recently a study that was done with a collaboration with CDFW and some other NGOs and researchers that showed that 92% of mountain lions statewide now contain traces of the rat poisons, the second generation ARs, and that's because they're consuming prey that have also consumed those poisons. It's not that they're consuming the poisons directly. So you're having this food web effect of all of these pesticides. Fishers as well. This photo on the left here is a Pacific fisher. And our science partner, the Integral Ecology Research Center, who has done most of the research on trespass grow impacts to wildlife, they conducted a study, I think it was in 2018, and produced a paper that showed that up to 80% of Pacific fishers are impacted by ARs in the North Coast region here. And this is because they're consuming small mammals that are eating these rat poisons. So you're getting the bioaccumulation there. It's actually impacted them enough where we're seeing a total life cycle change. You know, fishers used to not reproduce until they were about 3 years old. And now they're lucky to live to 3 years old, most of them. So huge impacts. And the fisher is an ESA, the Southern Sierra population of Pacific fishers are an ESA listed species. Another listed species is the northern spotted owl, very widely protected. I'm sure you all know or are familiar with NSO conservation. Northern spotted owls, there was also a study that was done that shows that 70% of them up here test positive for second generation ARs. So they're also consuming small mammals that are eating these poisons. So the food web implications are the serious aspect here. And it's challenging because there's so much trespass grow activity across the landscape that we're actually seeing landscape level impacts to our wildlife. We also see harvestable species such as black bears, mule deer have tested positive. So there's human health implications for that. You think you're getting, good, clean, harvestable meat, and it's actually tainted with trespass grow poisons. So I see that there's a question here in the chat. ARs are second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So it's a fancy word for rat poisons. Think of like warfarin, that's the first generation of ARs. And the second generation was developed when rodents developed a resistance to warfarin. So this second type of rat poison is what we're seeing at these sites. So yeah, if you ever hear me say ARs, I'm referring to rat poisons. I can just use rat poisons if that's easier for everybody. So there, like I was saying, there are some human health impacts here that we don't even know about for game species, and that's still under investigation. Dr. Murad Gabriel, who runs the Integral Ecology Research Center, IERC, he has had some of his own deer tested as well, and recommends that. Next slide, please. So trespass grows divert between 6 to 9 billion gallons of water annually. So this number was a number that we calculated based on the 2018 plant count numbers from the US Forest Service. And it's significantly more than what you're seeing for cannabis grows on private lands or licensed grows. This is very much like a flood and drain style watering. It's, a lot of this black polyline, the lines are fully charged even post the eradication day. So it's just a huge water issue. It's just running constantly. And we do see some drip lines and things like that, but a lot of the times, there's not this consciousness to be conservative of water. So the diversion aspect is a huge problem. And also animals, wildlife are known to chew through this black polyline. It's very, very common. So a lot of times you'll have leaks. So even if the line is charged and they have it off, it's still leaking. It's just constantly leaking. And some of these smaller water courses, like the class 2 or class 3 water courses that are really important during the dry times of the year for wildlife in the spring and whatnot, we're seeing that they're just depleted before they should be. And that's not because of drought, that's because of the trespass grows. Next slide, please. Well, actually, I think I'm done. So I'm gonna hand this back over to Rich and he can talk about the history of trespass grows.
Thanks, Jackie. So it's not like this is a new situation in California, right? There have been trespass grows on public lands in California for a long, long time. It began with legacy grows back in the 70s, small growers, local growers growing on public lands. That shifted. They started to move back to private lands in the 1980s. In the 70s and 80s, we saw a tremendous explosion in demand across the country, not just in California, but across the entire country. Use approximately doubled in that period of time. Sensing a market opportunity, cartels moved in big time in the early to mid 90s. They were closer to buyers. There was no need to cross the border with their product anymore. The border had received some increased attention and more enforcement on that. And needless to say, in Northern California, you have perfect growing conditions for cannabis and a culture that, at least at that time, was somewhat accepting of growing on public lands. So cartels moved in. The first bust by the Forest Service of a cartel grow on public lands was in 1996. Within 2 years, they estimate that there were at least 3,000 grows on public lands. And that is an extraordinary increase. They saw the opportunity, they saw the demand, and they moved in very, very quickly. That was fueled in a lot of ways by an absolute and total lack of law enforcement presence on national forest. It's a problem we still deal with. At that time and today, there's one federal law enforcement officer for every 250,000 to 350,000 acres of land. That is an extraordinary number. And there's no way in the world that any one person can cover even a quarter of that in a season. And that's presuming they have the whole season to actually do it, which they don't, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Slide, please. The evolution of trespass grows is fascinating. There are now grows on most public lands in the state. There's a great deal more, although you can't tell it by this slide, which is an outdoor grow in Death Valley National Park, of all bloody places. But they've gotten a lot better at hiding their grows. There's been an increase in the sophistication of concealment since 2018. The Forest Service thinks some of that has to do with the additional press and the additional publicity that's occurred since that time. They have now moved from plantation grows to scattered grows. And we're seeing that in virtually every national forest in the United States. As opposed to one big plot of 10,000 plants or 5,000 plants, we're seeing 5 or 8 or 10 grows of plants. And the downside of that is that you've got a carbofuran bottle at every single one of those grow sites. So as opposed to all of this toxic material and these poisons being located in one specific area where they can eventually be cleaned up, the photographs that Jackie was showing, they're now scattered all over Helen creation. So you've got a huge multiple of trespass grows. The Forest Service no longer does plant counts because they have determined that that is not the primary damage. That's not the right way to ascertain damage to the environment. It's the amount of environmental damage that is being done. And that's exactly what's happening in almost every national forest in the state at this time. There's another issue too, and that is that they are now purchasing or leasing long-term national forest end holdings, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. There's not a hell of a lot of enforcement there. They can slop their operations over onto public lands, which is what they're doing, and they can steal water from public lands to do it. This is a relatively new development. We're told by key people in the Forest Service, this is something they've really started to see accelerate in the last 2 or 3 years. And now it's a very, very common operation. The other thing that's fascinating, we just found this out a few weeks ago in one of our interviews, they're now franchising their operations. As many of you know, there's a lot of movement of trespass grow operations by cartels onto private lands right now as well. And that is not being done at the expense of their operations on public lands. They've simply moved to a franchise model where someone comes to them and says, I've got a crew, I've got the know-how, we can go in and do this, supply all the materials, and effectively we'll do a sharecropper program with you. And it's estimated now that that accounts for over 50% of the grows on the national forest in California, which is it's just mind-boggling when you think about it. And like I said, it is everywhere now. That photograph of the Grow in Death Valley National Park is a photograph we like to show because it really shows the extremes to which cartels will grow for their operations, and the fact that they're stealing water from places that really don't have much water to begin with. Next slide, please. Just one other thing I'll mention real quick. One of the ways that the cartels have been so successful is they have distribution networks set up through their gangs to cities in the Midwest and the East Coast. We estimate that 70% of national forest production is being exported to other cities out of state, and those people are sucking in the same poisons that are killing wildlife on California's national lands. So one of the things that we determined when we began this project was we identified a huge gap in knowledge. And one of the things that we started poking around on were trespass grow-caused wildfires. And we were stunned by what we found. And what we found, according to higher ups in the Forest Service, is perhaps half of what is actually out there. We've identified conclusively over 280,000 acres of national forest in California that have been burned with direct cause by trespass grow-caused wildfires. The estimated, if you look at average suppression cost, putting out those fires cost over $4 billion. So if you're looking for a cost-effective expenditure of both enforcement dollars and reclamation dollars, getting rid of those trespass grows and moving those cartels off of public lands is a very, very clear and obvious need. And there are just the landscape impacts to communities and ecosystems cannot be overstated. And the next slide is a good example of that. Chris, please. So the Dolan fire is sort of our poster child for trespass grow-caused wildfires in California. The Dolan fire in 2020 burned 125,000 acres. It burned through an iconic landscape in Big Sur. It burned through the condor sanctuary, killed 11 endangered condors. It overran a firefighting crew and critically burned 2 of them. One of those firefighters was in the hospital for well over a year. It destroyed over 20 homes. And last but far from least, it triggered the landslide that winter that cut Highway 1 for over 2.5 months. And that landslide covered black abalone beds offshore and killed thousands of them as well. And this was a purposefully set arson wildfire set by trespass growers, ironically, to try to distract firefighters and law enforcement from the major trespass grow that they had going on. That is now going to trial, and that trespass grower and some of his higher ups will be standing trial in March in Monterey County. Slide, please. The enforcement challenges are huge. As I mentioned before, it's now, there are grows, I believe I can say that there are grows documented in every national forest in the state, on most, if not all, BLM lands. There's thousands and thousands of sites. The lack of teeth in environmental laws is huge. The issue is no longer the plant. The issue is the environmental damage that's being caused by the grows. And the lack of federal laws against this sort of activity is really hamstringing enforcement. We have been told by senior people off the record in the federal government that if it was legalized nationally, it would be a lot easier for them to pass federal laws to actually attack this problem. So we can look to the day when that eventually occurs. In the meantime, we have major operations on national forest. Again, I mentioned it before, there's one Forest Service LEO for every 250,000 to 350,000 acres of land in the state. It's a ridiculous number. They don't grow on flat plains. This ain't Kansas, this is California. And the terrain is extremely steep and difficult. And by the way, they're now growing all the way up to 9,000 feet. There's a grow in the Los Padres National Forest that was discovered last year at 9,000 feet. So elevation is no longer a hugely limiting factor. And finally, there's limited federal resources and there's limited federal prosecution. There's great reluctance at the federal level to prosecute marijuana crimes now, even when they are cartel crimes, which is one of the reasons why we are pushing so strongly for the further criminalization of bringing pesticides onto public lands. Slide, please. The carbofuran that Jackie referenced, the poisons are being weaponized to target law enforcement. The photograph you see are punji stakes. It looks like something out of Vietnam. These punji stakes and booby traps are to dissuade law enforcement from coming in to take the site. There's a 1-year stabilization period between the time that all of this nasty stuff is found and the time that it can be removed. Wildfires are seriously restricting LEO actions, seriously restricting them. Most LEOs the last 2 years, one of the reasons we don't have better data for the last 2 years is because mid-season, all the LEOs have been pulled off their other enforcement duties and patrol duties to fight wildfires. So wildfires not only are very expensive and very costly to the environment, they're costing us our law enforcement people as well. Publicity and press has changed the cartel grows from landscape grows to multi-plot grows with the incremental increase in pesticide use that I talked about before. And finally, last but not least, they do have new sensing technology to be able to find that, LEOs are law enforcement officers. You know, one of our challenges is we talk in acronyms all the time, and we need to be slapped around for that a little bit. So my apologies for that. There is new sensing technology to determine where trespass grows are and the most likely areas for them to be grown. Unfortunately, the Forest Service does not have funding for the personnel to operate that technology. So it underlines again the need for federal funding. Slide, please. So the current state is there's thousands of sites IDing and needing reclamation. Franchise operations are now being run by polydrug cartels, which means they're not just involved in weed, they're also involved in fentanyl and other nasty stuff. New trespass grow activity in inholdings, banned pesticide use is increasing. U.S. Forest Service now says there's as much activity in the southern part of the state as there is in the north state, which is a big change. And that is something that we will be moving, a crop will be addressing more in the southern part of the state than we have in the past. So with that, I will turn it over to our policy director, Ryan Hinson, to talk about our policy efforts at the federal level. Ryan.
Okay, I had to play with the mute button there. What are we trying to do about this at the federal level? We're going to just talk about a few of the main things that we've been doing, and it's just a brief summary. So what we've been trying to do primarily is to get more money for the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management in particular to identify and reclaim to the extent necessary, and then prevent the establishment of grows. And we've also been trying to get bipartisan legislation passed to address the issue by doing things like increasing the penalties for the environmental crimes, the environmental damage associated with these grows, as Rich talked about, because the laws are pretty weak. And then we've been pursuing a lot of other policy avenues that we won't get to discuss here today because we don't have the time. But and one of the most important things that really struck me last week as I was reflecting on this PowerPoint, it really struck me that one of the most important things we've been doing is lawmaker education, just for general purposes, you know, even without an ask. And lastly, something else we've been doing that's very important is cultivating relationships with the BLM and the Forest Service. And I think it really helps to inform our work. Now I'm just going to review a couple of these things. Our effort to get more money for the BLM and the Forest Service primarily, and then our effort to pass bipartisan bills. So, oh, next slide, please. I was trying to advance it with my mouse. Yeah, so how are we trying to get more money for the Forest Service and BLM? Well, the name of the committee that we've been pressuring is at the bottom here. And the Forest Service and BLM both go through the Interior subcommittee in the House, even though the Forest Service is in the USDA, as you probably know. Well, we worked very effectively with my congressman, Mr. LaMalfa, and Mr. Carbajal of the Central Coast. We worked with them very well to get other members of the House to pressure Interior Appropriations leadership to provide funding to address this issue. Okay, and we succeeded in getting very significant increases in all of the important BLM and Forest Service budget categories that help address trespass grows. As Mike explained here of the Resources Legacy Fund can tell you, many people were trying to get the Forest Service more money, but we are proud to take a small part in the victory of the House approved budget, including really robust funding. In addition to the funding, we got really good, oh, sorry, if you could advance it, please. In addition to the funding, we got really good what's called report language. Okay, that's language that indicates the intent of the House. So this report language was in the approved House budget, and I'm not going to read it all, but suffice it to say, well, we drafted it actually, and now it's in the House approved budget. And so I'd say that's a great victory for the crop project, right? So, and it says basically that, yes, it's a very serious problem. And it says to the Forest Service and the BLM to go forth and address it. And oh, by the way, here's some money. So we are very proud to have been part of that. Next slide, please. Okay, now we are fighting it out right now in the Senate as best we can. Though I must say it is a rather confusing process, so it's hard to know where to throw your punches. And so our goal is for the Senate to match the House's numbers, obviously, or to exceed them. We'd be happy with that too. And we're trying to get House members to influence the Senate. Our two senators for California say that they are great on the issue already, and they seem to be, and they are fighting to the best they can, but they're not in the right positions to make the difference here. And so we're trying to influence other members of the Senate as well. We're currently mobilizing diverse public land stakeholders on a big sign-on letter. We hope to have over 50 groups. And if your group is not already on the Senate letter we recently sent around, please do let us know and we'd be happy to get you signed on. Very diverse letter, by the way, from a wide range of public land related groups, including the off-highway vehicle community and the Sierra Club on the same letter. Next one, please. So we've also tried to get bipartisan legislation passed, but it's been very difficult. It's difficult to do anything that's bipartisan, as you can imagine. The farthest we got was the Plant Act, Public Land Anti-Narcotics Trafficking, would have been by Mr. LaMalfa and Mr. Huffman, but they came down to a disagreement in the end about the criminal penalties, some issues there, and weren't able to move forward together. So now we're trying to come up with a new bill, and one of the problems with the Plant Act is it would have gone to like 3 committees, which is not a good thing. It's hard enough to get, as any of you know, some of you who work on legislation know, it's hard to get one bill through one committee. So our latest idea is to have one bill for one committee and to include, if you can go to the next one, include our various ideas in one bill apiece. So for example, a bill that focuses exclusively on giving the BLM and the Forest Service more money would be one idea for a bill, simple enough. And then another would be, and this is Rich's idea, a bill that would provide targeted county DAs with dedicated funding to prosecute the environmental crimes associated with trespass grows on federal land. So that's another idea. We are looking all the time for new ideas, new policy levers to pull on this issue. And if you do have ideas, please do share them with us. And is this my last slide, Chris? Okay, yes. So in my remaining 2 minutes and 50 seconds, let me just say that we have been cultivating a lot of excellent relationships, and we're hoping that an emerging champion for us will be Mr. Costa, who has expressed a real strong interest, and we hope that that he'll be a good ally for us. And we're constantly looking for new ones. And that's it for me.
Thanks, Ryan. Maybe just while I'm doing mine, maybe Jackie, Rich, and Ryan, if you can put your email contacts. Everyone should have mine since I emailed it to you or did the email reminder this morning. But if you do have specific questions and need some follow-up, please write down our information and be in touch as we move forward. Because yeah, this is a vexing problem, but we're trying to attack it from every possible angle. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at the state level, looking at another avenue that we're trying to pursue to bolster our work on this project. So the state of California is over 40% federal public lands. That sort of key fact, as well as sort of the specialty of the Cal Wild being on federal public lands, made sense for the crop project to begin our background and our research and a lot of our advocacy at the federal level. The state itself has a compelling interest in this issue, from the toxins and the public safety challenges to just the degradation of water sources here in the state. And so about 2 years ago, the crop project expanded some of our advocacy and outreach. And as Ryan mentioned, our education, since it's really an important element here, the lack of knowledge. But two primary state agencies are dealing with some of the environmental issues that come from trespass grows, and that's state parks and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. CDFW is the one, so that's Department of Fish and Wildlife, is the one that works most closely with partners, and they do the partnerships with the federal government in particular around sort of environmental enforcement that aren't on state park land. So they'll work with the feds, counties, as well as others in their enforcement duties. So because of that, we've worked a lot with CDFW, trying to figure out how they're looking to address this issue. They've gotten a significant amount of funding after Prop 64 legalized cannabis in California. During that time, so that was 2018 when tax revenue started to come in. During that time, DDFW has mostly been building internal capacity. They have focused primarily on the law enforcement aspect of it, and helping sort of get the legal permitting through for many of the legal growers who have had trouble, particularly around some of the environmental permitting that they're required to do. We have engaged with Fish and Wildlife. I think we're asking for and working on getting a degree of budget transparency, so we can dive even deeper on the issue and get a sense of where their priorities are and where they think they're actually going to deal with the issue in a more holistic manner versus going after one grow after another. And then we also have started our engagement with some of the legislature. So we've done a lot of education and engaged with offices. Assemblymember Wood's office has been particularly interested in doing some work on the issue. So we're excited to have his office's engagement. Right now, we have a current ask of $50 million over 5 years to the Cannabis Restoration Grant Program. And so that program lives within the overall cannabis program at Department of Fish and Wildlife, although last year that number was only at 2 million. So we really feel like there needs to be more money on the ground to deal with the huge number of trespass grows that are being identified and being cleared, but that restoration or remediation work really isn't getting to the level that we need. our next step at the state level, we're working on finding a Senate office to also back the 50 million over 5 years ask. We are working on a sign-on letter, like the one that Ryan mentioned, and we will send around both those letters to this group in case you are representing an organization and would like to sign on to that. And then one of the other avenues that we're trying to leverage or trying to engage with is getting the state to be better advocates at the federal level for getting money to address the issue. It's obviously, the state is obviously invested in making sure the cannabis industry is environmentally compliant and operating in the legal market as much as possible. And so we want to make sure that they become advocates as well for the same kind of work. So that leaves us about 13 minutes for questions. Again, I'll send around the letters that we have developed both for the state as well as the feds for Congress in an email. It'll also include a link to the recording of the presentation. So I will open up for questions. I have to do a quick transition. So everyone will now be able to unmute themselves. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can also see you. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand or wave back and forth or weigh in on the chat. I'm going to start with one question that was asked earlier in the presentation, talking a little bit about sort of the public safety aspect of trespass grows. What is the degree to which, how heavily armed are the people at these trespass grows, and what kind of danger do they pose to individuals who might come across them? Rich, do you want to take that one? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, okay now?
Yep.
So the question was, what are the dangers the public basically sees at trespass grows?
Yeah, what are the dangers? How heavily armed are they, and what are the dangers that present to the? So
the short answer is that the cartel growers are armed to the teeth. They're usually armed with semi-automatic weapons, and there's nothing that quite gets your attention like going out for an afternoon hike and all of a sudden you're looking down the barrel of an AK-47. So they're heavily armed. The pesticides that exist on that site are highly toxic. We know a number of people in federal law enforcement, as an example, who have either had to retire or have been hospitalized because of pesticide exposure. So it's very, very dangerous when you come across it. You should never go into one. You should report it immediately, back away, but don't go into the site because it is entirely possible that those pesticides have been weaponized, or you're going to find somebody with a gun pointed at you, one of the two.
Right, Sam, you want to ask your question? Can you get off mute? Great.
Yeah, could I actually even share my screen? Is that allowed, just to kind of drive home a comment that I have?
Hang on one second.
Awesome.
Why don't you start your question, and then I will enable that for you.
So just a little bit of background. Our organization owns and manages about 8,100 acres in Southern California, mostly San Bernardino, LA County. This is a situation we've only kind of become aware of in the last year and a half or so, as it started to affect our desert lands. Like you were mentioning, people are heading south. So I kind of just wanted to share a little bit of, our experience. Oh, there you go. Cool. It showed up. Let me pull up the video. So here is actually, basically, I just wanted to share our experience out here and kind of how it compares and talk about any resources you all might have to help us, because these grows, what you're seeing here, hopefully you're seeing this drone video that I'm sharing. This is a private inholding, which I saw got mentioned at one point during the presentation. So this is all BLM land, Bureau of Land Management, CDFW land, and also our private land that we own out there for mitigation and conservation work. But this is a 40-acre parcel that's privately owned. So, we are dealing with these grow issues on public land, but they're also happening on these inholdings. And this is 40 acres cleared corner to corner valuable tortoise habitat. Obviously, the tortoise is protected in our state. We have sightings of them less than a half mile south of here. You see, it's going to pan a little bit more, and there's a road leaving this grow operation, but that road cuts through BLM land, you know, federal land where it is illegal. So just wondering if there's any other ways that we can kind of find some teeth to go after these grows that aren't necessarily directly on public lands, but are still directly affecting public lands, directly affecting conservation. I mean, we can't even send our staff out here to monitor our own lands anymore because this is our land, just north of the property, just west of the property, and they bladed to the corner. But there's nothing we can do because they didn't do anything to our land. So I just wanted to share this also because I think this is a really powerful drone video, and I'd be happy to send this along if anybody wanted it. But I mean, this is 120 or so greenhouses on this property. There's 20 plus trailers. So people are living on site. We had to go out with a law enforcement officer just to take this drone video. And as soon as we put the drone in the air, they came looking for us. The police officers turned on their lights, and then about 20, 25 vehicles immediately left this grow operation as soon as they saw the police lights. So it's on private land, but it's also unclear. We don't even know if it's permitted or not. Obviously it's not, I guess, if they all scattered when the police showed up. But just an extra variable to this issue that you all are dealing with. We're dealing with a similar issue, but these extra variables of how do we deal with it when it's on private land. So I just wanted to share that in our experience, and just if you had any comments or experiences with that, we'd love some guidance because we don't know what to do right now. We've been reporting to CDFW, BLM, everybody who we have the ear of. So, yeah.
Rich, do you want to make a comment? I know you've been in touch with law enforcement and the Forest Service, who identified this as a big problem about people buying or somehow getting access to in holdings and then using them to grow.
Yeah, and we could, and Sam, we could probably spend the next hour talking about it. I mean, what I'll tell you is that you're not alone, and it's happening all over the state, and it's particularly frightening it happening in the desert. I'd suggest that we talk afterwards. I do have some ideas. I have some information I can share with you, as well as some contacts. So let's do that. You've got my contact information. Send me an email. We'll set up a time to talk. See if I can't get a couple of other people on the line, and we'll see if we can't help you out.
Thank you. That would be great. Really appreciate that.
And then on that issue, I saw that Matt Clifford mentioned too that you should be able to find out if it's state permitted. I don't know if Matt, you can make a note on that, but the state should have a registry.
Yeah, if there's a place to easily look into that, that would be great. I did look and notice, I mean, this area is not even zoned for agriculture. So if they were growing hemp in there, even that you would think would be illegal or a code enforcement issue. So, yep. And it's critical habitat. So you would think they'd have to do mitigation for any development. But anyways, thank you for giving me that time.
Well, Shane, thanks for sharing that.
Sorry, Chris,
go ahead, Jackie.
No, I was gonna come off mute and ask you if you knew if that was zone critical habitat, because if it is designated critical habitat, technically they have to alert Fish and Wildlife for any potential projects, even if they don't require a federal permit, anything that's going to impact critical habitat, which it seems like that area is. So yeah, you should email us and we can help with some of that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Sam. Corey Brown, you got your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to add to it, Sam, in Prop 64, there's criminal provisions that make it a felony if you're illegally growing marijuana in California and you violate one of several environmental laws or water rights laws or others. You may want to talk to the district attorney in the respective county to get them interested in this. They would probably need to get the Bureau to cooperate with them or ask them to get involved, but educating your district attorney on this could be helpful initial step on this. Alerting the media so that the media starts picking up the issue is another way of potentially getting more attention and more politicians, including DAs, focusing on the issue as well.
Yeah, that footage will be great for local television. All right, any other questions? Anything I missed? I can look back through the chat and make sure I got everything. There was a question about tracking other mechanism for discovering grows, just sort of using Google Earth imaging or something of that sort. I don't know if Richard, Jackie, you want to talk a little bit about what's going on just the tracking of establishment of grows?
Jackie, you want to take it?
Yeah. So the Forest Service, in collaboration, the local office here in Arcata, in collaboration with IERC, the Integral Ecology Research Center, they developed, it's a GIS model, and it's kind of two different models. It's a definitive model over a predictive model that essentially uses, one of the models is to assess habitat features. So the same way that you can do a predictive habitat map for northern spotted owls and add in all these habitat variables to determine, distance from a stream, et cetera, old growth forest, things like that, canopy closure. All those habitat variables are used to determine areas that would be good for trespass grows. So it's using a predictive habitat model. And some of the features are distance to nearest watercourse, distance to nearest road, aspect, south and western facing aspects are obviously more ideal. There's a couple other variables there, but it was developed and then used to identify potential grow sites. And so this model will spit out, these areas that are most ideal. And then of course you have to go in and manually vet those. So you either have to do a flyover or you have to look at satellite imagery. But one of the pictures that I had on the slide there, the site that, it was one of the trash sites, but that was one of the sites that was actually identified using that model. So with our recent meetings with the Forest Service, we learned that model is not being used as readily as it once was. And that's just because of the way that activity has kind of expanded into private land in holdings on Forest Service, in national forests. It hasn't been funded in the way for a statewide survey it should have been. So that model is not actually being used as it was originally intended. And now we're learning that most of the eradications that are happening are actually happening from witness reports or people calling in grow sites. That's actually the biggest factor in determining which sites get eradicated each year. So,
and it goes back to it also goes back. Look.
We hear you. You're on. Nope, now you're off.
It also goes back to lack of funding for the Forest Service. I mean, they were very, very clear that they have the technology now, but they don't have the people to operate it. So it's a maddening catch-22. It really is.
Ryan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, we were told, by the way, that it would only, and I say that only cost about $1 million to do this analysis for the state. And so one of our objectives in Congress, I didn't mention it earlier, was to get that $1 million for this satellite, for this GIS exercise. It seems like a very wise investment. And so we're going to continue trying to pursue that, but yeah.
So we're coming up on 1 o'clock now. I want to first thank you all for taking the time to learn more about this issue. We continue to find every door and window we can push on to try to make some progress, both at the state and federal level. So we'd love your continued engagement. As I mentioned before, we'll send a summary email. It'll have links to our state and federal congressional or our federal appropriations letters for you all to sign if you are associated with an organization. And so appreciate any additional names and organizations we can get on those. And then I'll include a link to a YouTube of the presentation as well. So if you have colleagues and others that you'd like to share it with, please do feel free. So thank you again for your time and effort, and look forward to continuing to find ways to progress on the issue. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you all.
everyone.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Bye.